A man bought medicine for an old woman who couldn't afford it, and weeks later he received a strange call. Julian Montalvo let out a sigh as he drove down the city's main avenue. Raindrops slid across the windshield, reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. The storm had subsided, but the air was still filled with humidity. He switched radio stations for the umpteenth time without finding anything to distract him. It was just another day in the endless succession of his routine. Office, paperwork, meetings. Since his divorce, life had turned into a series of grey moments that blended into one another. He was returning home, a modest rental on the outskirts, where silence was his only companion. A throb of pain pulsed in his temple. The accumulated fatigue weighed on his shoulders. He decided to stop at the corner pharmacy to buy some aspirin before continuing on his way. He parked the car and got out with heavy steps. As he reached the entrance, his eyes fell on a figure waiting in front of the counter. An elderly woman, dressed in a worn wool coat, held a small leather bag against her chest. Her hair, completely white, was tied up in a perfect bun. There was something in her posture that gave her a natural elegance, as if she still carried with her the echo of an illustrious past. "Excuse me, miss, how much do my medicines cost this time?" the old woman asked in a calm voice. "That would be 1,400 pesos, Doña Estela," the pharmacist replied, leafing through the prescription. "I'm afraid prices have gone up." Julian saw the woman's expression darken. She searched in her bag and pulled out a couple of crumpled bills, counting them slowly. "I don't think I have enough," she murmured. More to herself than to the clerk. There was a brief silence. The pharmacist looked at the old woman with a mixture of pity and resignation. Julian felt a sudden impulse, as if something inside him compelled him to act before the woman turned away and left empty-handed. "Put it on my account," he said, stepping up to the counter. Doña Estela turned her head in surprise. Her eyes, a deep grey, examined him intently. "That's not necessary, young man," she said with a hint of pride. "I can't accept something like that." "Don't worry," the man replied. "Consider it a favor from a stranger." "Da." The woman looked at him for a long moment before offering a slight smile. "Gentlemen are not extinct after all," she said sweetly. "Thank you." Julian paid the bill and took his box of aspirin, while the woman picked up her bag with the medicines. As he stepped out, he felt a strange warmth in his chest, a contrast to the cold night surrounding him. He never imagined that gesture would change the course of his life. The next morning, the man woke up later than usual. The morning light came through the blinds, casting golden lines on the ceiling. His first thought was that, for some reason, he had slept better than in the previous days. He stretched slowly, letting the laziness of dawn fade little by little. While making his coffee, he recalled the episode from the night before. Paying for a stranger's medicine wasn't something he usually did, but neither did it seem like such an extraordinary act. It was an impulse, a natural reaction to the woman's obvious need. Yet, for some reason, he still felt a strange satisfaction when remembering it. After breakfast, he grabbed his briefcase and left for the office. The city, still damp from the previous night's storm, gave off the scent of wet earth. He had barely taken 2 steps outside his house when he noticed something out of place. Stuck in the slit of the door was a note written in delicate handwriting. He took the note, slipped it into his pocket, and headed for his car. He would read it later, surely it was bills to pay. However, in front of his car, a small bundle trembled among some blankets. He approached and saw that it was a kitten with greyish fur and big eyes, frightened and dirty. He crouched down without a second thought. "And what are you doing here?" he murmured, extending his hand. The little animal looked at him cautiously before sniffing his fingers. It didn't seem more than 2 months old. Julian frowned, undecided. He didn't have pets and had never thought about having one, but leaving it there, in the cold morning, seemed cruel. He lifted it carefully and carried it inside. He looked for an old towel and gently cleaned its fur. The kitten curled up in his lap, trusting. "Well, I suppose now I live with you," he said softly. He left the little one in an improvised box with a blanket and went out again, making sure to close the door tightly. At night, he would bring food. That morning at the office passed with the usual monotony. However, at lunchtime, he received unexpected news. "Did you hear?" Rodrigo, his friend and co-worker, said while pouring himself coffee. "Hear what?" asked Julian, not paying much attention. "They fired Urrutia," he replied with a barely concealed smile. Julian raised an eyebrow. Ernesto Urrutia, his direct boss, had been running the department for years with a mix of despotism and incompetence. Everyone in the office hated him, but no one had dared to challenge him. "Are you serious?" he asked. "They kicked him out this morning." Apparently, the board discovered some irregularities in the projects he was handling. "I don't know the details, but they took him away without even letting him pack his things," his colleague explained. Julian took a while to process it. He had spent years enduring that man's toxicity, and suddenly he had vanished from his life. The surprising part was that he didn't even feel euphoric, just relieved. "Well," he murmured, "I told you that sooner or later karma was going to catch up with him." Rodrigo joked, patting him on the back. "Maybe luck is finally smiling at you." Julian gave a half smile and didn't think much more about it. However, when he returned to his desk, the idea unsettled him a little. He didn't believe in superstitions, but it was curious that right after his encounter with the old woman, life seemed to be aligning in his favor. Later, after leaving work, he decided to stop by the pharmacy. He wanted to buy food for his new feline companion and, at the same time, make sure the woman was all right. Perhaps the pharmacist knew something. When he entered, he saw Camila Rios, the pharmacist from the previous night, arranging products on the shelves. "Good evening," he greeted. Camila looked up and smiled at him. "Good evening." "Not today. I just came by for a syringe to give milk to a kitten and some food. Also," he hesitated briefly, "do you know the lady, the woman from yesterday?" Camila tilted her head with curiosity. "Yes. She comes often. Her name is Estella. Not many people buy medicine with that kind of prescription, so it's easy to remember her." Julian hesitated a second before pulling out the note he had found at his house that morning. After all, it wasn't any bill to pay. "Today I found this on my door." The girl took the paper and read it carefully. "Yes, it looks like her handwriting," she said, handing it back. "She came by here in the morning and asked where you lived." Julian frowned. "You have my address?" Camila leaned on the counter with her arms crossed. "No, but we do have your name," I told her, "and I suppose she looked you up somewhere. Nowadays, it's not so hard to find people. The internet solves everything. I hope you don't mind that I gave her your name." Julian shook his head, downplaying the matter. "It's fine. After all, I meddled in her business first. It just seems strange to me that she went to so much trouble. People often forget to be kind. Don't underestimate your action." The pharmacist replied with a warm smile. Julian looked at the note again. "Thank you for your kindness. Goodness is never lost in time." It was a simple message, but there was something in it that gave him a feeling hard to describe. Camila watched him with a subtle smile. "Maybe it was fate," she said as she prepared the man's order. Julian left the pharmacy feeling that the world around him had shifted just a little. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not, but he couldn't deny that in less than 24 hours, his life had filled with small, unexpected events. That night, while the kitten purred beside his pillow, he couldn't help but think about what might come next. The next day, the phone rang late at night, breaking the silence of the house. The man, half asleep on the sofa, half opened his eyes and reached for the coffee table. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. He hesitated a few seconds before answering. "Hello? Hello? Good evening, young man," said a female voice on the other end of the line. "Do you still remember when you paid for my medicine?" Julian sat up abruptly, waking the cat that was sleeping in his lap. "Doña Estela," he said, surprised. "That's right," she replied with a soft laugh. "I knew you wouldn't forget me so easily." The confusion snapped him fully out of his drowsiness. He hadn't expected to hear from the woman again, much less for her to call him in the middle of the night. "How did you get my number?" he asked, still trying to process the situation. "Older people have our tricks," she replied in an amused tone. "But that's not why I'm calling. I'd like to invite you to the theater." Julian raised an eyebrow. "The theater? La Dame o Camelias." "Friday at 8 at the San Martin Theater. I have a seat reserved for you and a companion if you decide not to go alone." The name of the play sounded vaguely familiar to him, though he didn't recall ever having seen it. He glanced at the time on the wall clock. "Why are you inviting me to the theater?" he asked, not hiding his curiosity. "Because there are stories that can only be understood when they're seen on stage," she said calmly. "And because I want to tell you something." The man felt a twinge of intrigue. He had no real reason to accept, but neither did he find any reason to turn down the offer. "All right, I'll go." "Perfect," she replied. "See you Friday." With that, the line went silent. Julian slowly lowered the phone, still wondering what he was getting himself into. Friday came faster than he expected. During those days, the thought of the date at the theater circled his mind endlessly. He couldn't quite understand why the old woman had insisted that he go, nor what was so important that she could only tell him there. For some reason, he felt he should take someone with him. He thought of Rodrigo, his co-worker friend, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. He had no patience for such things. Then he remembered Camila, the pharmacist. The idea seemed absurd at first. They barely knew each other, and he didn't even know if she was interested in theater. Even so, when he stopped by the pharmacy after work, he surprised himself by mentioning the invitation naturally. "I don't usually go to the theater," she said, arranging some boxes behind the counter, "but it sounds interesting." Julian wasn't expecting an immediate answer. "If you feel like it, I have an extra ticket," he said, trying to sound casual. Camila looked at him with an amused smile. "Are you asking me out on a theater date?" He laughed, scratching the back of his neck. "It's a courtesy invitation." She watched him for a few seconds before nodding. "All right, let's go." The man felt an unexpected relief. The San Martin Theater stood imposingly in the middle of the city, its old-fashioned facade lit by warm lights. When Julian and Camila arrived, the line of spectators was slowly moving toward the entrance. Doña Estela was waiting for them in the lobby, dressed in an elegant black coat and a silk scarf that gave her a distinguished air. Her upright posture and sharp gaze reminded one of someone who had once been used to being the center of attention. "Julian," she said with a smile, "and I see you've brought company. Doña Estela, this is Camila," he introduced. The pharmacist shook her hand politely. "A pleasure to see you outside the pharmacy." The pleasure is mine," Estela replied. "Come, the performance is about to begin." She led them to their seats in the third row. From there, the stage was perfectly visible. The hall was full, but the atmosphere was solemn, as if everyone was holding their breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. When the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, Julian felt a strange sense of expectation. The play began with an intensity he hadn't expected. The dialogues, the music, the way the actors filled the space with their presence. It wasn't like watching a movie or reading a book. Every movement, every word carried a particular weight, an emotional charge that felt real. Even though he had never shown interest in theater, he found himself immersed in the story. There was something hypnotic in the way the protagonist conveyed her inner struggle, in the restrained gestures of the characters, in the tension that was built slowly yet relentlessly. Beside him, Doña Estela watched the scene with a serene expression, though something deeper shone in her eyes. At a key moment, when the protagonist faced a decision that would seal her fate, the old woman murmured, without taking her eyes off the stage. That's life, Julian. One act after another, some define us, others haunt us. He glanced at her, intrigued. She smiled with melancholy. When the play ends, you'll know. The man turned his eyes back to the stage, feeling that the story unfolding before him wasn't the only one he had to understand. For the first time in a long while, he felt on the verge of discovering something important. The theater fell into absolute silence as the curtain slowly descended. There was no music to mark the end, no smooth transition. Only the momentary darkness before the audience burst into applause. Julian blinked, as if just waking from a trance. During the 2 hours the play lasted, he had completely forgotten himself. He couldn't remember the last time something had absorbed him that way. Beside him, Camila applauded with a sincere smile, while Doña Estela kept her hands on her lap, watching the stage with the same stillness with which she had arrived. Her expression was hard to decipher, as if she were there and, at the same time, in another time and place. The actors made their final bow, and the lights of the hall gradually brightened. People began to rise and collect their coats, still whispering comments about the performance. "It was incredible," said Camila, turning to him. "I didn't expect to like it so much." Julian nodded, still processing what he had seen. The story of La Damo Camelias had struck him more deeply than he imagined. It wasn't only the protagonist's tragedy, but the way everything had been built slowly toward an inevitable end. Doña Estela, however, did not move right away. She kept gazing at the stage, as if she still saw the story unfolding before her. "Did you like it?" the man asked curiously. The woman slowly turned her head and looked at him with a half smile. "I've seen it many times," she replied. "And still, I always find something new in it." She stood up with the same grace with which she had arrived and picked up her purse. "Now, Julian, it's time to tell you what I promised." Camila exchanged a quick glance with him, as if unsure of what was happening. The man also felt a strange anticipation, but he didn't ask anything. Deep inside, he knew the time had come to hear what Doña Estela had to say to him. They left the theater and walked down the cobblestone street to a small, discreet cafe, away from the bustle of downtown. The place had an old-fashioned air, with dark wooden tables and dim lamps. It seemed like one of those places that had always existed, immune to the passage of time. They sat at a table by the window. Doña Estela ordered tea, Camila asked for coffee, and Julian, still unsure whether he wanted to stay awake or sink into his thoughts, ordered the same. The old woman intertwined her fingers on the table and let out a sigh before speaking. "Julian, when I saw you that night at the pharmacy, I knew it hadn't been coincidence," she finally said. "There was something in you, something I recognized immediately." He frowned slightly. "Uncomfortable." "Recognized?" Doña Estela nodded, her eyes fixed on him. "Your way of being in the world, the way you moved, the weight on your shoulders," she explained. "I too have lived with that burden." Julian felt a chill. It wasn't the answer he expected. "What burden are you talking about?" The old woman smiled sadly and looked at her cup of tea before continuing. "There was a time when I was a known actress. Not a star, but someone people recognized when I walked down the street. I played all kinds of roles, but the ones that suited me best were always those of women trapped between duty and desire." Camila rested her elbows on the table, listening intently. "Why?" "Because I too lived trapped," murmured Estela. "In a marriage I never wanted." The revelation fell like a stone in the air. Julian didn't know what to say. "When I was young, I fell in love with a man who had nothing but his hands and his talent," she continued, with a voice that seemed to get lost in her own memories. "He was a sculptor, an artist who shaped stone with infinite patience. I loved him with all my being, but in those days it wasn't enough. The man didn't need to ask what that meant. My family had other plans for me," Estela went on. "A man with power, with money. Someone who could give me stability, but never love." "Ed," Camila pressed her lips together as if finding it hard to accept. Didn't you try to run away with him? Estella let out a soft laugh, but without joy. Love is beautiful, but life is hard, she replied. Loving someone isn't enough to make everything turn out right. The silence that followed was heavy. For years I was his wife, she continued. I played my role, carried my life with the dignity expected of me. But every time I went on stage, every time I played a woman struggling against her fate, I felt that for a few hours, I could be free. Julian turned his gaze to his cup of coffee. Something in those words hit him harder than he would have liked to admit. What happened to him? He asked quietly. Estella lifted her eyes and, for an instant, the man thought he saw the shine of restrained tears in them. He left, she said. One day he wrote me a letter and told me he couldn't go on waiting. The coffee grew cold on the table as silence settled between them. The years passed. My husband died. Fame faded, she went on in a softer voice. I was left with memories and with the certainty that, in another life, I would have chosen differently. Camila lowered her gaze, moving her cup between her hands without knowing what to say. Julian felt an invisible weight settle in his chest. When I saw you that night at the pharmacy, I knew you were trapped in something similar, the old woman said, breaking the silence. Not in a forced marriage, but in a life that doesn't feel like yours. The man swallowed hard. That's why I wanted you to come tonight, Estella continued, because theater shows us what we sometimes don't want to see. I saw you looking at the stage with the same desperation with which I looked at it when I was young, as if the answer to something you don't quite understand was there. Julian didn't reply right away. He felt Camila's eyes on him, but he couldn't find the words. Maybe you don't yet know what you're searching for, Estella said softly. But you've already taken the first step to find it. The cafe clock struck midnight. Outside, the city carried on without noticing that, at a table by the window, a story had been told without the need for stage or lights. That night, when Julian returned home, he stopped in front of the hallway mirror and stared at himself for long minutes. For the first time in a long while, he felt that someone had seen something in him that not even he himself had recognized. An urgent need to discover what it meant flooded him, leaving him nearly breathless. The coffee from that night remained imprinted in the man's memory like a lingering echo. In the days that followed, Doña Estella's words resonated in his mind with unsettling clarity. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something in him that even he hadn't recognized. Since his divorce, he had convinced himself that his life was simply on pause, a period of transition before something else, though he had never known what. But now, after that conversation, he began to wonder if, in reality, he had been avoiding the most important question. Was this the life he wanted to live? The hours at the office felt more monotonous than ever. The absence of his former boss, which had once been a source of relief, now felt like an insignificant change within a system that kept running with the same indifference. His desk, the piles of papers, the meaningless conversations with his co-workers, everything had an air of endless repetition. Rodrigo, his friend and co-worker, noticed his distraction. "You've been in another world lately," he commented one day at lunch. "Everything okay?" Julian looked at him without knowing what to answer. "Yeah, I've just been thinking." Rodrigo laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Don't tell me you're philosophizing about life. You already sound like an old man." The man gave a half smile but didn't reply. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was overthinking something that had no answer. That afternoon, while checking emails without really reading them, his gaze drifted to the window. From his fourth-floor office, he could see the city's accelerated rhythm. People came and went without stopping, trapped in their own routines. He wondered if he was just another one among them, moving without any real direction. When the workday ended, instead of going straight home, he took a detour without thinking too much about it. That morning, in an irrational impulse, he had walked to work, just to break the monotony a little. His steps carried him to the pharmacy. Camila was behind the counter, organizing some boxes of medicine. She looked up when she heard him enter and smiled. "If you keep coming here like this, I'm going to think something's wrong with you," she joked. Julian rested his arms on the counter. "Maybe there is something wrong with me," he said with a sigh. She tilted her head, evaluating him with her gaze. "Do you mean that seriously? Since I went to the theater with you two, I can't get certain things out of my head," he confessed. "It's like my perspective on everything has changed." Camila crossed her arms and leaned her hip against the counter. "And is that bad?" "I don't know," he replied. "I think I've never stopped to think about what I really want." She smiled softly. "Then, that's a good start." Julian looked at her for a moment before shaking his head with a brief laugh. "Are you always this optimistic?" "Only when it's worth it," she replied with a playful smile. "Want a coffee?" "I'm about to close." He nodded and waited while she finished organizing things. The woman worked efficiently, but without the automatic haste of someone who only wanted to end her shift. She had a light air, as if everything in her life flowed naturally. Julian envied that quality a little. They left together and walked to a small cafe 2 blocks from the pharmacy. The city, at that hour, had a particular calm, with the lamplight reflecting on streets still wet from the afternoon rain. They sat by the window and ordered 2 coffees. For a while, the conversation revolved around trivial topics: work, customers' quirks at the pharmacy, insignificant anecdotes. But at one point, Camila set her cup down on the saucer with a faint clink and looked at him more seriously. "You know, Doña Estela doesn't usually talk like that with just anyone," she said. "I've worked at the pharmacy for years and never saw her so interested in someone as she is in you." Julian played with the handle of his cup. "I don't understand why either," he admitted. "But when she told me her story, I felt there was something in her that reminded me of myself." Camila rested her chin on one hand. "What do you mean?" He took a breath before answering. "My life didn't turn out the way I expected," he said. "When I got married, I thought I had found stability, that everything was in its place. Then, when she left, I felt the ground disappear. I convinced myself I just had to keep going, focus on work, let time do its job. But now I'm not so sure." Camila looked at him in silence, giving him space to continue. "Doña Estela lived her life trapped in a decision she didn't fully make," Julian went on. "And even though I'm not in the same situation, I can't help but wonder if, in some way, I'm also trapped in something I no longer want. In the end, it seems everything she told me at the cafe is true." The coffee in his hands had gone cold. Camila smiled softly. "Maybe what you need isn't to escape, but to decide what comes next." The man looked at her, surprised by the simplicity of her response. That night, when he arrived home, he found a letter in his mailbox. It had no sender or postal stamp, only his name written in elegant handwriting on the envelope. He opened it carefully and found inside a brief note. "Tomorrow afternoon, in the park across from the theater. I have something else to tell you." No signature was needed. He knew it was from Doña Estela. The message didn't specify an exact hour, but Julian knew he had to go. The next day, after work, he walked to the park with the feeling that something important was about to happen. He found Doña Estela sitting on a bench under an old tree, a beige coat over her shoulders and her hands clasped on her lap. He approached and sat down beside her without saying anything. "I knew you'd come," she said with a smile. "People like us can't ignore an invitation like this." Julian let out a short laugh. "People like us? Those who have begun to wonder if their life belongs to them," she replied. The man stayed silent, watching the leaves crunch beneath his shoes. "I want to show you something," Estela said, pulling a small notebook from her bag. She handed it to him without another word. Julian took it and carefully turned the pages. They were fragments of memories, notes written in the same elegant handwriting as the letter. Stories about her life in the theater, about the man she loved, about the feeling of always playing a role, on stage and off. "It's my life, written with my own hands," she said, because memory fades, but words remain. Julian closed the notebook gently and looked at her with a mixture of respect and melancholy. "Why are you showing it to me?" Doña Estela smiled warmly. "Because I think you also have a story to write." The bells of a nearby church struck the hour. The man held the notebook tightly, feeling that in his hands he carried something more than just pages. That night, when he got home, he opened the notebook and began to read. For the first time in years, he felt that his life wasn't on pause, but on the verge of a new act. Julian's nights had grown longer since he began reading Doña Estela's notebook. He opened it every night before sleeping, diving into her words as if they were fragments of a lost world. They weren't only memories, but scattered thoughts, reflections on the passage of time, on what it means to exist when everything one once was begins to fade. The stage gave me an identity, but it also took it from me. People called me by the names of my characters and applauded the woman who wasn't me. Now that there's no curtain separating me from reality, I wonder who I really was. Read one of the fragments. Julian turned the pages carefully, as if each word were made of glass. He wondered if the woman had written those lines intending for someone else to read them, or if they had been only for herself, an attempt to record what life had denied her. At some point, without realizing it, he began to write his own thoughts in an empty notebook. It wasn't something he used to do. He had never considered himself someone who put his life into words, but now he felt the need to. He wrote about his divorce, about the silence that had accompanied him in recent years, about the strange feeling of being on pause, waiting for something that never seemed to come. He wrote about the pharmacy, about the theater, about the way Doña Estela had shaken his routine without even trying. One afternoon, while going over some invoices at his desk, Camila stopped by his office with 2 coffees in hand. Lately, they had been seeing each other more often outside of work, though they never spoke openly about what their relationship meant. There was a naturalness in her company, a silent understanding that needed no explanation. "I can see you're different," she said, setting the coffee down on his desk. The man looked up. "Different? How?" "More focused, like you found something to think about." Julian took the cup and sipped. "Maybe I did." The woman rested an elbow on the table and watched him with a half smile. "And are you going to tell me what it is?" He slid a finger over the cover of his notebook before answering. "Doña Estela left me something. A notebook with her story, her thoughts. I've been reading it for days and I can't get it out of my head." She blinked, surprised. "She gave it to you?" "Yes," he said, still feeling the weight of that responsibility. "And I think she wanted me to read it for a reason." Camila didn't answer right away. She took her own coffee and drank a little before speaking. "Maybe she wanted you to understand something about yourself." Julian let out a short laugh. "That scares me a little. That's the first step," she said lightly, though her eyes hid something deeper. The man didn't reply. Instead, he looked out the window, where the city carried on, unaware that, in that office, someone had just begun to understand himself a little more. A couple of days later, Doña Estela called him. Her voice sounded more fragile than usual, but still carried that calm, almost theatrical tone. "Julian, I need you to come with me somewhere." He didn't hesitate to accept. When he arrived at her house to pick her up, he found her thinner, with a thick coat over her shoulders and her hair perfectly tied up. Her eyes, however, still shone with the same intensity as always. She got into the car slowly, and during the trip she spoke very little. She didn't say where they were going until Julian saw the silhouette of a small church in the distance. "This is the place," she said calmly. The man parked and quickly got out to help her. The church was modest, with a red tile roof and weathered stone walls. The entrance had a carved wooden arch and an old lantern flickering in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of incense and candle wax. The walls were decorated with Orthodox icons and an altar draped with a cloth embroidered in golden thread. Doña Estela walked slowly down the central aisle until she stopped in front of a white-bearded priest waiting beside a baptismal font. Julian watched the scene without fully understanding what was happening. "I'm going to be baptized," she said, as if reading his thoughts. He blinked, surprised. "Why now?" The woman smiled softly. "Because I want to close this story with an act that's mine and no one else's." The man didn't know what to say. He only watched her as a nun helped her remove her coat. She wore a simple white dress, which contrasted with the solemnity of the place. The ceremony was brief but intense. While the priest recited the prayers and poured the water over her forehead, Julian felt something strange in his chest, an emotion he couldn't define. When it was over, the woman turned to him with a calm smile. "Sometimes, changing doesn't mean running away," she said, "but accepting who you really are." He felt a knot in his throat. That night, when he got home, he opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence before going to sleep. Maybe life isn't about finding answers, but about asking the right questions. The morning air carried a light chill, announcing the arrival of winter. Julian tightened his coat as he crossed the park on his way to the hospital. The last time he had seen Doña Estela, she had still retained some of her energy, but something in her gaze had warned him of the inevitable. Her body was giving way, though her spirit remained firm. Since her baptism, she had spoken less and less about the past. Instead, she seemed more interested in what was happening around her, in the small details of the present. When Julian visited her, she asked about Camila, about his work, about the notebook where he had begun to write. She never asked him to read what he wrote, but always smiled, knowing that he did. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Doña Estela's daughter in the hallway. Her face was tired, with dark circles carved by sleepless nights. "She's awake," she said softly. Julian nodded and gently pushed open the room's door. He had received the news of her hospitalization during the night, and since then, a knot in his chest had stayed with him. He was distressed and angry in equal measure, because the woman had never told him about her illness. Even so, he didn't blame her knowing her. He knew she could never have endured seeing worry in his eyes. Doña Estela was lying in bed, the sheets perfectly arranged over her thin body. Her skin had a pale tone, but her eyes still shone with the same intelligence as always. "You came," she said, with a faint smile. "Of course I did," the man replied, approaching. "I wouldn't miss the chance to hear one of your stories." The old woman let out a soft laugh. "There are no stories today," she murmured. "Only goodbyes." Julian felt a pang in his chest, but said nothing. He sat on the chair by the bed and gently held her hand. "How do you feel? Ready?" she answered without hesitation. There was something in the serenity of her voice that disarmed him. There was no fear in her expression, only a calmness that seemed unusual for someone in her final days. "Julian," she said after a moment of silence, "do you remember when I told you that acts of kindness always find their way back?" He nodded. "I remember." She narrowed her eyes, as if trying to gather the strength to continue. "I want you to remember this too. Life gives us opportunities, but we are the ones who decide whether to take them or not. Don't let the fear of making a mistake keep you in the same place forever." Julian swallowed hard, feeling a knot in his throat. Doña Estela looked at him tenderly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "You are no longer the man I saw that night at the pharmacy." The man felt something break inside him. "Thank you," he said softly, because he couldn't find anything else to say in that moment. She gently squeezed his hand and closed her eyes. That was the last time he saw her alive. The funeral was held a few days later, on a grey afternoon when the wind blew softly through the cemetery trees. The ceremony was simple, without grand speeches or ostentatious tributes. Yet the number of people who attended said more than any words could express. Veteran actors, former theatre colleagues, neighbours, friends from the pharmacy, even strangers who had once crossed paths with her and had been marked by her presence. The man remained silent during the ceremony, his hands in his pockets and his gaze fixed on the freshly placed headstone. Camila was beside him, wearing a grey coat and a serious expression on her face. When the last handful of soil was thrown onto the coffin, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Julian and Camila were among the last to stay. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. It took him a moment to answer. "About everything that's changed since that night at the pharmacy," he said, "and about how she knew it from the beginning." Camila looked at him tenderly before gently taking his hand. "Are you still writing in your notebook?" "Yes," he replied. "More than ever." The woman smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. "Then, her legacy is still alive." Julian intertwined his fingers with hers and exhaled slowly. "Yes," he murmured. "It's still alive." Time passed without him noticing. Days became weeks, then months. Life went on, as it always did. But he was no longer the same. Camila and he began to spend more time together, until one day, without the need for words, they knew they were walking in the same direction. Their relationship was built without haste, without the urgency of filling voids, but with the certainty that they had found in each other something more than companionship. It wasn't a sudden or passionate love story, but one that grew with time, with shared silences and afternoons of conversation without the need for grand promises. When the woman became pregnant, Julian felt something like vertigo, not out of fear, but because for the first time in years, life was offering him something he truly wanted. The day their daughter was born, the world seemed to stop. He held her in his arms with almost reverent care, looking at her small, delicate face. Camila looked at him with a tired but love-filled smile. "Have you thought of a name?" she asked softly. Julian held the baby a little tighter and nodded. "Estella," he said firmly. Camila smiled and nodded gently. It was the only name that made sense. Years later, Julian once again stood in front of the San Martin Theatre. The building looked the same, with its old-time facade and golden lights illuminating the entrance. The street lamps lit the cobblestone street, and the marquee shone with warm lights, announcing the night's play. Next to him, Estella, 5 years old, looked around with wide-eyed wonder. Her small hands clutched her father's coat as she studied the big poster. The golden letters formed a title she still couldn't quite read. But it seemed important. "Did Mrs. Estella work here?" she asked curiously. Julian felt a pang of nostalgia at her question. He knelt to her height and held her little hands between his. "Yes," he replied with a smile. "Here is where I learned that life is like a play." Estella tilted her head, frowning with concentration. "What does that mean?" Julian slid his fingers through his daughter's dark locks, brushing aside a curl that had fallen across her forehead. "That every day is a new scene," he explained, "and that we always have the chance to decide how we want to perform it." Estella seemed to consider his words with the seriousness of someone trying to understand a secret of the world. Then, her eyes lit up with excitement. "I want to see the play," she said, clutching his hand more tightly. Julian laughed softly and lifted her into his arms. "Then let's go." As they crossed the theatre doors, the scent of wood and velvet enveloped them. The murmur of the crowd and the sound of the orchestra tuning their instruments filled the air. As they walked to their seats, Julian looked up at the great red curtain. Estella settled on his lap and rested her head against his chest. "Daddy," she whispered before the lights dimmed. "Do you think Mrs. Estella is watching us?" Julian felt a knot in his throat. "Yes," he replied softly. "And I think she's smiling." The lights went out completely and the curtain began to rise. A new performance was about to begin. And so, dear friends, we reach the end of this story. I've loved sharing it with you, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to it. Don't forget to subscribe and give it a like so I can keep bringing you stories of kindness, love, gratitude, and hope. Leave me a comment if you liked it. Sending you a hug, and see you in the next story.